Hi, I'm Rob Stewart, a graduate of Carleton University's Vertebrate paleontology program, and today we're going to be talking about the terrestrial crocodiles of the Cenozoic. The early mammals who inherited the planet had much more to fear from terrestrial crocodiles than dinosaurs ever did. The terrestrial crocodiles family became even more successful during the age of mammals than it was during the age of the dinosaurs. Where before the Cenozoians had to tremble under the weight of dinosaurs, now they were the apex predators and grew to be the largest predators on land the Cenozoic would ever see. The most terrestrial crocodiles of all time evolved during the Cenozoic. The planocranids had these high domed skulls filled with sharp serrated teeth, more like a theropod dinosaurs than a traditional crocodile. In fact, their teeth were so theropod-like that scientists originally thought they had found some late surviving dinosaurs when they first discovered the teeth of these terrestrial crocodiles, before they'd found any of their skulls. These high domed skulls would have been perfect for applying bite force, but unlike a freshwater crocodile's skull, they weren't good for pinning prey in place, instead good for crushing them or slicing at them. They also had their legs tucked up underneath their bodies, and their osteoderms, the bones in their skin that protect them from each other and other predators, actually extended to cover their sides. In modern crocodiles, osteoderms are only found on the top because modern crocodiles are almost always being attacked from above. But planocranids were living on land, so attacks could come from any side. So they had scales running all the way down to their arms and their legs, as well as on top of their bodies. They had shorter, stubbier tails that they would hold aloft instead of the thick, paddle-like tails that modern crocodiles have. Most strangely of all, these crocodiles didn't have long claws like their ancestors did, but platformed claws at the ends of extremely long toe bones. They would have looked like nothing so much as the hooves on a pig or a goat, and we think that they used them to gallop after their prey, like some kind of bizarre flesh-eating horse. These weird galloping crocodiles were some of the first apex predators to evolve after the asteroid disaster, with the most common two species, Bavarosuchus and Planocrania, spreading all across Asia, Europe, and North America, and growing up to 3 meters in length. Their main rivals as apex predators were mammals, who had started evolving into the niche almost immediately after the extinction of most of the dinosaurs. Their main rivals and competitors were carnivorous mammals who had also evolved hooves to gallop after their prey, called mesonychids, as well as other terrestrial crocodile species that were evolving during this time period. Even the dinosaurs gave it a go. Cenozoic from the Paleocene of Colombia grew 1 to 2 meters long and had a cylindrical torso and reinforced limbs tucked under its body, perfect for running, not so good for swimming. These are marine crocodiles that left the oceans to come back onto land and evolve to be terrestrial. But something far older had survived in South America, something far more practiced at being a terrestrial crocodile. The Cenozoians, who we explored so much in the last video, had survived in the form of the sebecids, a burrowing species that had escaped the asteroid impact, unlike any other land predator that had lived during the Mesozoic. None of the dinosaurs, none of the large mammals, only the sebecids survived the extinction event. Where the Cenozoians before had produced dinosaur-eating terrors like the Sumatran tiger-sized Barusuchus, now they grew to even bigger sizes as they started chasing after the mammals that were evolving to fill in the niches that ornithopod dinosaurs had left behind. Bretosuchus of the Paleocene was typical of these post-Cretaceous Cenozoians. Emerging in Argentina about 60 million years ago, it was already 4 meters long, at least as big as Barusuchus had been, and with room to grow now that it was on top of the food chain, rather than hiding from abelisaurs in their shadows. While Bretosuchus itself is known only from skull bones, Sebecus of the Eocene of South America is known for much more complete remains, including leg bones. reinforced elbow joints, as well as elongated leg bones on the front legs, as well as a set of narrow hips on the back legs that would have allowed the legs to be tucked directly under the body, show adaptations for running that aren't found in non-terrestrial crocodiles. And a study of the brain case of Sebecus actually shows the exact same thing. Just like tyrannosaurs, the olfactory bulbs in Sebecus were massive and would have allowed it to track prey by scent across the land, something that crocodiles can't do from the water. But the Cenozoians still showed some adaptations for life in the water, despite having been living on land for almost 100 million years now. Their jaws still show adaptations for being able to trace vibrations along the ground, which is very helpful when your prey is approaching you at the watering hole, but much less effective when you're chasing them along the land. They also had the exact same sort of bite that modern-day crocodiles do. Crocodiles famously have an incredible jaw pressure when crushing down, but very, very weak jaws that you can hold closed when trying to open them. Even though the skull shape of Sebecus is completely different from the skull shape of a modern crocodile, the jaw muscles show the same properties. Very, very powerful when biting down, but a modern-day human, feeling very, very brave, could grab a Sebecus by the skull and hold its jaws closed, just like a modern-day crocodile. Despite these holdover adaptations for aquatic life, the Sebecids proved extremely successful, not just spreading all across South America from Colombia to Argentina, but all the way across Africa and Europe too. The last of the planocranids, living in Spain at the time, a creature called Durosuchus that would have been about 5 feet long, lived just long enough to meet the gigantic Sebecids coming in from South America to start spreading across Europe. Iberosuchus of the time was 3 meters long, twice the size of Durosuchus, and lived in Spain at the same time. 2 terrestrial crocodiles from completely different families, living in completely different niches in the same ecosystem. But it was in the Eocene of France that the Sebecids of Europe reached their climax. The absolutely gigantic Dentaniasuchus of the Middle Eocene of France had a lower jawbone the size of a human femur. Depending on how you scale the size of its head, it could have been as little as 4 meters and as much as 8 meters long. The European terror bird, Eleutheroornis, would have been 5 feet tall, one of the largest predators in its environment for the time, but it would have been utterly dwarfed by Dentaniasuchus living in the exact same localities. A complete reversal of the situation of Barusuchus being dwarfed by theropod dinosaurs during the Mesozoic. How exactly the Sebecids came to Europe isn't entirely clear. The earliest Sebecids from the age of dinosaurs all come from Europe. Ogresuchus from Spain and Duratodon from Austria are the earliest known members of the family. But there aren't any Sebecids from the Paleocene of Europe, only the Eocene afterwards. Is there another ghost lineage amongst the Cenozoians, like there was between the Jurassic and the Cretaceous period in the last video? Well, possibly, but another theory is that they actually island hopped the way terror birds did, first from South America, then to Africa, and then up to Europe, in the same way that Lavocatavis and Eleutheroornis made it from Algeria to France. There's also a Sebecid from Algeria called Eremosuchus, but its remains are so fragmentary that it isn't actually clear if it's closely related to the South American Sebecids or more closely related to the European ones, or some form in between, which is what you would expect if they had been island hopping. Some scientists say that Africa is where the Sebecids that survived the Cretaceous extinction came from, radiating out from Algeria into South America and then up to Europe. But some scientists propose that actually this island hopping chain happened in reverse. The Sebecids survived the Cretaceous extinction in Europe, and then there's a ghost lineage through the Paleocene leading to Dentaniasuchus and Iberosuchus, and then Eremosuchus represents a transitionary species to the South American Sebecids, who started colonizing from Europe, spreading across the Paleocene. This is contradicted by the oldest Paleocene Sebecids all coming from South America, as early as 63 million years ago. much, much earlier than any of the European or African sebecids. But because the remains are so fragmentary, and this was so far in the past, the possibility of any one of these theories being true is still there. Just like the terror birds who had island hopped their way from South America all the way up to Europe, the sebecids suffered localized extinctions at the end of the Eocene period as the temperature began to drop and it became too cold for them to survive in Africa and Europe. Instead, all surviving sebecids held on in South America, but just like the terror birds, they experienced a massive radiation there, growing in size and diversity across their time during the Eocene period. During the Miocene, just like the terror birds, the sebecids again began to grow in size. In Colombia, there are fragmentary remains of a crocodilian called Langstonia, which grew to be about 4 meters long. Not much is known about this crocodile species, other than it was one of the largest predators of the area, although the recent discovery of a femur fragment of a terror bird from Colombia suggests that it may have had some serious competition in the swamps of Colombia. Because these animals are so fragmentary, it isn't clear which of them was bigger. What is clear is that the largest predator of the entire Cenozoic evolved in South America from the sebecid family during this time. Berenosuchus is known only from a fragment of snout that is bigger than the skull of a polar bear. Based on the measurements of other sebecids, this giant crocodile was calculated to weigh as much as 1,700 kilograms, closer in size to a rhino or a small elephant than to any mammal predator, past or present. No bigger carnivore from our own family has ever walked the planet. From the biggest of the short-faced bears to the giant entelodons that we covered a few videos ago, and even the famous saber-toothed cats, not one land mammal even approached the size of Berenosuchus, the largest predator of the entire Cenozoic period, at least on land. Not only was Berenosuchus one of the biggest predators of the Cenozoic, it was also one of the most successful. From the Middle Eocene 42 million years ago to the Middle Miocene 11 million years ago, Berenosuchus was one of the longest-lived genera of the Cenozoic time period. During the span in which Berenosuchus existed, the entire entelodon family evolved and then went extinct. It lived to see the closure of the Tethys Oceans, which had existed since the time of the dinosaurs. It started to see the rise of the Andes. It would have existed during the same time period when whales first went into the water and started to evolve echolocation and baleen. And it would have existed for longer than many mammal families alive today have even been alive. Cats, cows, whales, and even ourselves, apes, have been along for less time than Berenosuchus existed as the top predator of South America. A massive stretch of time for any genus to be the top predator. Whether pound for pound or year by year, Berenosuchus was a more successful predator than any of the apex mammal predators that have existed during the Cenozoic period. But no species lasts forever, and Berenosuchus was no exception. Just like so many families of crocodiles and birds before it, the advent of the Ice Ages was ultimately the downfall of the Notosuchian clade, and Berenosuchus with them. There's some purported remains of Notosuchians at the boundary between the Miocene and the Pliocene, but unlike the terror birds, there's no evidence that sebecids survived past the Pliocene period into the Pleistocene. Just 10 million years from the modern day, the Notosuchians, which had existed since the Jurassic era, finally went extinct, so very, very close to the finish line, to the modern day. We think of ourselves as living in normal times, an average, the standard by which every other time period should be measured. But the truth is that the modern Cenozoic is actually one of the coldest periods on Earth since life first evolved. We exist in a time period that is more extreme in cold temperature than any other environment that has existed since the Carboniferous some 300 million years ago. If the status quo of 200 million years had lasted just that little bit longer, and warm temperatures had lasted into the age of humans, we would have survived to have seen these incredible animals that had existed since the middle of the age of dinosaurs. But sadly, they went extinct just short of the benchmark, and so these wonders from this bygone era are no longer with us. But humans did live to see one group of terrestrial crocodiles, a group of terrestrial crocodiles that they encountered as they spread out across the world. When the Aborigines first came to Australia during the late Pleistocene, they found it a continent that was filled with giant reptiles. There was, of course, the infamous giant ripper lizard Megalania prisca, but there were also more obscure reptiles like Wanambi, a type of giant snake from an extinct family, and the giant Bluff Downs python. But Megalania prisca was effectively just a gigantic Komodo dragon, and pythons exist today, including pythons that got even bigger than the ones I just described. On the other hand, they also found something that's unlike anything that we have alive today, the Mekosuchian crocodiles. A more blunted and rounded skull, along with those same sharp theropod-like teeth with the serrations along them for cutting, and nostrils pointed at the front of the skull instead of on top like crocodiles that lived in the water, all suggest that this was a more terrestrial crocodile than even its relatives who were better at high walks. The problem is, the only remains of Quincana that we have are fragments of the jaws and the teeth. These fragments can construct an idea of an animal that would have weighed about as much as a wolf or a lion and been about 3 meters long, a far cry from the gigantic bear or rhino-sized cebechids of South America or France. But we do have a fragment of Quincana that suggests that a size that great might have been possible. One piece of the rostrum, or the nose, from a Quincana that has been found has been estimated to be as big as 6 meters long. Unfortunately, that rostrum is not very well studied, so scientists have called into question whether this size is accurate or not. But if true, this would mean that there were not only gigantic Komodo dragons, up to 3 times the size of the ones alive today living in Australia, but also alien terrestrial crocodiles, unlike anything that's alive today, every bit as big as the ones in the Eocene of France or the Miocene of South America, but living at a time when humans would have been some of their prey. Assuming, of course, that Quincana was a terrestrial crocodile at all, because some scientists have argued that because we don't have the leg bones, it might be semi-aquatic just like so many of its relatives. So far, the only evidence that we have that it wasn't an aquatic animal was the fact that its skull is shaped like the terrestrial crocodiles we know from more complete remains, including one of its relatives. There was a Mekosuchian that we know for certain was terrestrial, although this was a much smaller animal. The animal after which the group was named, Mekosuchus, was a 60 centimeter long crocodile at the smallest and 2 meters at the biggest, a far cry from the perhaps 20 feet long Quincana that we have. But it is known from the material behind the skull, and this material shows that it had a shorter neck that wasn't as wide as modern day crocodiles. It had a reinforced heel bone that would have allowed it to remain stronger when walking on land. And crucially, it had a very long and straight back leg bone, which had muscle attachment sites that don't resemble the muscles of crocodiles that swim and haul themselves onto land, but rather crocodiles that run, like the planocranids or the cebecids. Despite living long enough to come in contact with early humans, there's no direct evidence that Quincana ever did. By the time the Australian Aborigines reached what would become their homeland, Quincana was already on the decline. Quincana, like the cebecids, called jungles and riversides its home. And those jungles and riversides were starting to dry up as the Ice Age started, and Australia became a more arid and desert-like place. The formation of the ice caps was locking up all of the fresh water, and Australia was becoming the desert that we know today. Again, something it wasn't for the past 60 million years, until suddenly it was. And because it had been a lush jungle for so long, just like Barenasuchus before it, was actually a remarkably long-lived genus, making it some 28 million years, another incredible stretch of time that's longer than some families of mammals. By the time the Australian Aborigines had solidified their culture, Quincana was already missing from the continent, probably extinct, There are no records, no rock art, no stories, no real recollection of Quincana in the cultural memory, and it was a very rare animal at the time when the Australians would have shown up. It might have simply vanished before they even saw it, the two of them coexisting but passing each other without ever actually interacting. But Mechosuchus did survive long enough to interact with humans for sure. And in fact, like with the Themistomeres before it, humans probably dealt the death blow to this very last of this long and ancient lineage. While Mechosuchus likely went extinct on the Australian mainland at the same time as Quincana and so many other members of the Australian fauna, on the islands of New Caledonia and a place called Vanuatu, they managed to hang on until the very first human colonists arrived. There, they would have found a creature with diverse teeth that would have been able to crush shellfish, eat small invertebrates by the waterside, and catch small animals living at those riversides. Exactly like its earliest relatives, Protosuchus, the ancestor from which all of these crocodiles descended. Just like its ancestors 200 million years ago, it would have been filling the niche of a small animal. But it's unclear what the locals did when they found this animal. It's certainly clear that whatever they did was enough to wipe it out, but it's not clear whether they were hunting it or whether the pigs or rats that they introduced were damaging to its eggs. Maybe they displaced it by cutting down its habitat. Whatever the case, it certainly survived into the time period when human beings would have come into contact with it. And humans spread around those islands at such a rate that it certainly would have been encountered by them. This strange little running crocodile on the rivers and shorelines. Where Quincana might have eaten Australian Aborigines, it's almost certain that the inhabitants of New Caledonia and Vanuatu would have at least eaten some parts of this small crocodile, which was only about the size of a little dog. It's a true tragedy that, like so many animals that humanity wiped out all over the globe, it's only thousands of years later that we've come to appreciate how rare and precious what we had was. By the time there were scientists who were eager to study these animals, whether they be natives of New Caledonia or people from all over the world equally interested in crocodiles, all that they had left to study of them were bones. But there are terrestrial crocodiles still alive today, at least partially. The freshwater crocodiles of Australia alive today can gallop like a horse, echoing the planocranids of old for just a moment before they run out of stamina and return to their sprawling posture that we know them more famously for. And the tiny African dwarf crocodile is perhaps the most terrestrial crocodile of them all. Every evening, they haul themselves out of the rivers that they call home to go scampering through the jungles of the Congo, hunting for small animals, insects, crustaceans, even small mammals and other reptiles. In fact, scientists use the behavior and movement of the dwarf crocodile as a model to imagine how creatures like Protosuchus, the very first crocodilians, would have lived. And it's a body plan that has existed from those rat-like creatures like Erythrosuchus in the Cenozoians to Mechosuchus of the Mechosuchians, all the way up to today with the dwarf crocodile. A part of a lifestyle and a lineage that has existed for as long as crocodiles have, 200 million years. So even today, there are some crocodiles that are carrying on a proud vestige of that terrestrial lifestyle. But even with these echoes of what once was, it's sad that we'll never get to see these majestic animals as they truly were. Of course, none of us want to be eaten by a giant crocodile the size of a bear, but it's undeniable that something was lost in this 200 million year old group losing these branches of its family tree at the very end of the Cenozoic era. That we'll never really know the life history of something that was so common across the planet for such a long period of time, something that was normal for the animals of the past. For as much as these animals would have been terrifying predators, so were wolves before we turned them into dogs. There's all kinds of incredible animals alive today that are dangerous, but we appreciate for their majesty and beauty. And they have smaller relatives who we find familiar, maybe even companions. And sadly, because of a downturn in the climate and quirks of evolution, We just don't have a part of this Cenozoic community of animals that was alive very recently, even long enough for our own relatives to meet. And there's something sad in that. But for as sad as it is that we're missing marine and terrestrial crocodiles today, the crocodile family as a whole has carried on the proud tradition of semi-aquatic ambush predators that stretches back to the Mesozoic. Across the Cenozoic, there have been freshwater crocodiles that were ambush predators, some like the ones that we know today, and some of them very different. Whatever the case, we'll get to explore them in detail in the next video when we go over the Cenozoic history of crocodiles as we understand them in the modern day.